Good evening, and welcome to part 2 of our Daily Drum Town Hall discussion, Making It Plain, African Americans and the COVID-19 Vaccine. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, we pick up from last night's discussion. We had a robust dialogue about the vaccine clinical trials process and why the issue is of paramount importance to the Black community. Tonight, we bring you some of the foremost leaders on this issue from around the country. These Black experts represent research, medical, the religious, and healthcare communities. They are decision makers who are here to answer our most probing questions. This town hall is brought to you in part by WHUR, the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, Howard University, Morehouse School of Medicine, Meharry Medical College, Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, the National Medical Association, Cobb Institute, and the National Urban League. Tonight's special is being streamed on WHUR.com, YouTube, Facebook Live on WHUR, blackdoctor.org, and the National Urban League. It will be rebroadcast on our sister station, WHUT-TV, at a later date. Now, we will not be taking any phone calls, but we invite you to post your questions and comments online using the hashtag #VaccineTownHall. We have Dr. Reed Tuckson from the Black Coalition Against COVID-19 online right now to address your questions throughout the program. Plus, we have a special Q&A online at 8 p.m., so please stick around for that. Now, we want to begin by giving a quick overview of some of the key points that were made last night by our experts. Dr. Tuckson, a big part of the discussion last night was about informed consent as it relates to the vaccine. Can you tell us briefly what that means and why is it so important?
When we are considering participating in a clinical trial, which is a research study that looks at whether or not the product works better than another product or nothing at all, called placebo, when we're involved in that, the individual participating in that study has a right to know what the risks are and what the benefits are. And so in carefully constructed language, patiently communicated to an individual, you learn about whether or not you should participate or whether you shouldn't participate in that particular study, what your rights are, and how the process will occur.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Tuckson. We appreciate that. Of course, he will be online to answer your questions during the program, just as he was doing last night. All kinds of great information coming from Dr. Tuckson online. Now, joining me tonight to guide us through the town hall is Dr. Valerie Montgomery Rice. She is president of the Morehouse School of Medicine. Dr. Montgomery Rice, thanks for joining us. Let's face it, there's been a lot of back and forth on the coronavirus pandemic and the push for a vaccine, even within just the past 24 hours. Yeah. In the midst of all of the rhetoric, most Americans just want to know the basic truths. How will it work? Is it safe? And when will it be available? Talk to us about that.
So, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited about being here in this discussion. So when we think about, we spent a lot of time last night talking about safety, right? And so this is what the research is about. The research is about how do we get people enrolled in the trial to make sure that it is safe. So there are lots of different vaccines that are being evaluated right now, and we have to have a diverse population in there in the trials to make sure that when an individual gets it, we have the expected outcome, that we don't have what we call untoward events or some unexpected complication. And so that's why we are really trying to work toward ensuring that African Americans, Latinx persons, people who have been undervalued, have the right information, such they can make us, as Reed just talked about, an informed consent, that they understand the risk and the benefits.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about that specifically about safety concerns, mm-hmm. because there are so many people who are saying even if it becomes available, they're not going to take it because they don't trust it. How do you deal with that pushback? We get a lot of pushback for people with the flu.
Right. Yeah. So, I saw the profile of the survey that came out from our readers, our listeners yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And many of them said they wouldn't take the vaccine. And that really did concern me. And it says to me that we have to do a better job with saying, why should you be involved? We have to do what we are planning to do at Morehouse School of Medicine. As you know, you may know that we got a $40 million grant from HHS to Office of Minority Health to develop linguistically and culturally tailored information that will address the concerns that people have about the vaccine. So how do we go into a community, partner with grassroots organizations in those communities, and create the information in a way that makes it plain, right? Makes it simple so that people understand the risk and the benefit. It first begins with who the messenger is. And that's why the 4 historically Black medical colleges are fully on board with this. And you're going to hear from a couple of my other colleagues tonight. We understand that we are a trusted entity, but we have worked hard to build this trust, right, over time. And so what we are hoping is that we will be listened to, and that we will listen to our community and be able to provide them with a level of security that we would not offer them this opportunity to participate in a trial if it wasn't safe.
One of the things that we discussed last night, and it's one of the big discussions that we've heard a lot about in the news over the past several months, is when is it going to happen? The head of the CDC said yesterday that he didn't expect for it to be available until at least the middle of next summer. Certainly the President Trump has given him pushback on that. He's saying before the end of the year. There was discussion about before the first week in November. We know about those politics. But talk to me a little bit about just the process, even without being in the midst of a pandemic. How long does it take a vaccine to go from development to ready?
So usually it takes sometimes 3 years, sometimes 5 years, sometimes 10 years. And we know that we're hearing language about warp speed. And one of the things that I think everybody needs to understand, because we're saying warp speed does not mean that we're cutting corners. So you're seeing parallel tracks, right? So you're seeing the vaccine being developed, and that vaccine, if it comes out that it is not effective, then actually it wouldn't get used. But they're making larger products of the vaccine early on. As in any clinical trial, it goes through several different phases. Sometimes it usually starts in a cell line, then there's animal testing, and then there's small groups of people who are tested to look at the right dose and safety. And then typically it goes to a point where we are tweaking the dose, sometimes at what we call a phase 2 trial. And then we get to phase 3, which is where we are right now with most of the vaccine studies, where we are putting the intervention or the test dose in a larger group of people. Now, the one thing that you see is that in each of the trials, they're talking about enrolling 30,000 people. Okay, so that's a lot of people to be in sort of a phase 3 trial. But they're doing that because we understand we need to have diverse individuals in this trial. Remember, I said we got to know. Let's say if you're a person who has sickle cell trait, okay, and we know that this virus impacts our cells in a way that causes, let's say, inflammation, or it causes vascular problems, okay? And so what we want to make sure of is that people who have what we have come to be comfortable with, common chronic diseases, are not going to have untoward episodes or unexpected side effects when they take this vaccine. Mm-hmm. So we are moving faster, but you think about it as we're doing parallel tracks. And at each part of those tracks, though, we have to make sure that it is safe. Mm-hmm. And so what we are hoping, as the 4 historically Black colleges, medical schools, we are all going to be enrollment sites. Many of us are also involved in the research arm of the vaccine development, but we are hoping that we will be a trusted voice for people to come to and to feel comfortable that if we recommend being enrolled in this trial, you know that we wouldn't recommend this if we did not believe that all the precautions were in place and that it was going to be safe.
Well, I think, and you touched on this earlier, when you talk about diversity and the process with the 4 HBCU medical colleges participating, how important is it when you're talking about issues of ethnicity, specifically racial background, and even to a further extent, gender, and having to make sure that you also have not just men participate, but women?
Well, we know it's very important. If you look early on, many, many years ago, when the Framingham study came out, right? And this was a study looking at cardiovascular disease and looking at multiple things have come about with that study, where they looked at the people who they were studying for many years, and they would look at different interventions. And it initially was mostly men. And so a lot of the therapies that were tailored were then tailored based on men. And when women start to try to use those same therapies, they had unexpected side effects. And part of that is because our vasculature is different. So having gender diversity is also very important. Now, we know that when we look at the genome, there are not a lot of differences that we think. However, if you look at the genome, remember about 95 to 98% of the people who they received samples from to create the genome were Caucasian. So we don't know all that we probably should know. But we believe that there are not a lot of differences at the genetic level. But that doesn't mean that there are not a lot of what I would call environmental influences that have occurred at the cellular level that can make gene expression be different. And so therefore, it may put someone at a different risk profile because of the cellular environment based on race and ethnicity. And so we have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that we don't have all the answers. And the way you get those answers is that you engage diverse people in the clinical trials, and you give them all of the guardrails for safety. You have these data safety monitoring boards that are going to be looking to see if there are unexpected events, and then you're going to have engagement so that people feel comfortable with reporting when they are having a unexpected event that wasn't listed on the profile list of things that they expected to encounter. And that all means that you have to have trust. Trust between the investigator, the person who's recommending that you be in the trial, and the subject. And remember, they're not patients, they are subjects, because they are volunteering to be in these trials.
Excellent point. And of course, we're going to drill down a little bit more on that later on in the program. Thank you for sharing. And of course, you're going to be continuing with us during the course of this really important discussion, Dr. Montgomery Rice. Let's bring in to this part of the conversation, Dr. Randall Morgan. Dr. Morgan is the executive director of the W. Montague Cobb Institute. Now, the Institute conducts research on issues that impact the Black community and other medically underserved populations. Dr. Morgan, how has and how will COVID affect health disparities that are already prevalent in our community? Share that with us.
Well, good evening, and it is certainly my pleasure to be with you this evening. COVID has made the work of the Cobb Institute more relevant and certainly more urgent. It has uncovered the marginal health status of many individuals in our communities who suffer with chronic disease. The attention placed on communities of color and the clear picture for all of us to see with regard to disadvantages of crowded living conditions, the lack of healthy food options, and environmental issues that can cause respiratory compromise in the COVID-19 infected individuals is unfortunate. We have focused at the Cobb Institute upon strategies to make the environment healthier and to improve access to appropriate care. There must be strategies for the long run. Our lives will not be the same for the next 18 months. Even with an anticipated vaccine available to members of our communities by early 2021, new public health interventions are needed now to ensure that our citizens who are at higher risk for COVID-19 infections are offered the vaccine first, and the health status of everyone is a priority. The next challenge we have is to slowly decrease the vaccine mistrust that is at high levels in all of our communities. We must not lose our place in line for vaccines that we deserve simply through fear.
Dr. Montgomery Rice, your questions for Dr. Morgan.
So Dr. Morgan, you know, the Cobb Institute has a long-standing history of looking at chronic diseases and looking at those diseases that really sometimes we've sort of brushed under the rug. And what we don't want to happen, though, is that let's say we get the vaccine and everybody starts to take it, and we then forget about all the things that COVID-19 uncovered for us, the disparities that we knew already existed. COVID-19 allowed us to sort of pull the curtain down. How will the Cobb Institute be involved with ensuring that people don't forget?
Well, I think the Cobb Institute will be involved because we are working extremely hard with our partners. The Cobb Institute was born of the National Medical Association, and we are totally affiliated with the National Medical Association. So all of our work is through those clinicians who are seeing the patients every day. And what we try to do is be at the nexus or the connection of our 4 historically Black medical schools, as well as the National Medical Association, as well as even the Congressional Black Caucus, to look at all of the confounding issues with regard to our health in communities. So we have to continue to focus upon access to care. We have to continue to focus upon the ability for patients to be cared for all of the conditions that they presently are afraid to go to the hospital or even to their physicians for care. So this is why we feel that it's going to be a unified effort, which is going to have to be redoubled to care for patients, because we're dealing with an accumulation of patients who have conditions that they have put off, may have hypertension, may have heart attacks, may have all different types of problems, which they have not been able to seek care for. So we have to make sure those patients are taken care of. But at the same time, we have to continue to encourage our community to step forward and help to solve this vaccine dilemma so that we can have a healthy community.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. One of the things that you just referenced is something that we've seen here in Washington, D.C. The city health officials, not just in D.C. proper, but also in Maryland and Virginia, have all discussed the reality that because people are afraid and that they are not going to see the dentist, they're not going to get their checkups. And I think this is particularly the case. Unfortunately, there was an article in the Washington Post just today talking about Latinx women who are pregnant and that they may even be more at risk. And I would imagine that would also be the case for Black women as well. Pregnant now, afraid to go see the doctor. And that, Dr. Morgan, and that's for you also, Dr. Montgomery Rice, and I'll start with you, Dr. Morgan, really, really complicates the thing for people of color and their health right now.
Well, very much so. And I think we have to take advantage of some of the newer technology. There's a lot of technology now in terms of monitoring cardiology patients so that from a distance, physicians are able to check their care and keep up with them to a greater degree because they are afraid to come into the office, or they absolutely don't have the transportation in these days to get there. The other area that many physicians are becoming more involved in with now is with telehealth and telemedicine. Again, being able to keep touch with patients, to communicate with patients, and then sometimes spend an additional amount of time with patients just in a very calm fashion, face to face, and convince them that it is safe for them to have the basic health care assessments that they need, and in many cases facilitating that assessment whenever it's possible, so that the patient doesn't have to spend an inordinate amount of time waiting, driving, sitting in a waiting room, or run the risk of becoming infected themselves because of the lazy attitudes of many people who are around them.
A good point. Dr. Morgan, again, thank you so much for your input here. This is part 2 of our 2-night town hall edition of the Daily Drum, Making It Plain, African Americans and the COVID-19 Vaccine. I'm Harold Fisher, joined by the president of Morehouse School of Medicine, Dr. Valerie Montgomery Rice. We want to remind you that we will be doing a special Q&A with all of our experts participating after 8 p.m. Dr. Reed Tuckson with the Black Coalition Against COVID-19 is online right now taking your questions. So feel free to give your input there and join the conversation using the hashtag #VaccineTownHall. I'm going to bring in our next experts, Dr. David Carlisle. He is the president of the Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science. Also with us, we have Dr. Melissa Clark, community health advocate and social media personality. We are bombarded daily with information on the vaccine and its timeline. And just as quick as one story comes out, another version hits the headlines to refute that information. So talk to us about the misinformation and what that does to the African-American community. Dr. Carlisle, let me start with you. You work in South Central Los Angeles. What are you hearing? Dr. Carlisle, unmute your microphone if you can, please.
Thank you very much for asking me to be with you this evening. The major concern that people are expressing is the question, am I being experimented upon? And I can assure individuals that this vaccine, when you are going to be taking it to fight COVID-19, is not an experiment that is being directed against the African-American community. When you are being given the opportunity to take the vaccine is going to be something that is being offered to you to benefit you. That's the major question. Am I being experimented upon? And can I trust the system to protect me? And the answer coming from our African-American physicians is a resounding yes.
Thank you so much. Please go right ahead, Dr. Montgomery Rice.
So Dr. Carlisle, you're there in the throes of things, and I know that your organization, Charles Drew, did a lot of early testing and still doing a lot of testing for the community there. I know you did a massive amount of testing. So when the persons come and we're now trying to convince them to enroll in a trial, what are the questions they should be asking their physician? What are the 1, 2, 3 questions they should really be asking about this vaccine as we are trying to convince them to consider enrolling?
Well, there really are 3 questions, and the questions are pretty straightforward. The first question is, should I take this vaccine? And this is a fair question for every doctor to receive, and every doctor will be able to answer it. The second question is, why? Why should I take this vaccine? Again, your doctor is fully equipped to answer that question. And then the third question, most importantly, is this vaccine safe for me?
Those are very, very important. And Dr. Clark, Now, as I understand it, you are always in the throes of the discussion, whether it's on a social media platform or some other platform. Would you say there are additional questions we might want to ask? I have, as a patient or as a subject, ask beyond those three?
Yeah, I would ask, does it work and how well does it work? And let me also say I'm happy to be here and very glad to talk with you, Harold, and Dr. Montgomery Rice. That would definitely be the first question I would ask. I would also add, Joe, though, just in terms of the misinformation that I'm hearing in the community, I have a weekly streaming show that talks about health, and the comments that I'm hearing from the audience also are questions like, you know, I think I've heard that the vaccine is going to put a microchip in me, or this is going to be used for population control, or they're going to inject a virus in us just like they injected people in the Tuskegee study. So there's a lot of misinformation circulating out here. And it turns out when you look deeply into it, that it is coming from social media, and that social media is being pushed and weaponized by the same people that did it in 2016 around the political misinformation that was done. And that's Russian trolls and bots. Believe it or not, they're into also disseminating misinformation around the vaccine. And several academic studies have shown this. They analyzed 3 million tweets. About 98% of them were about vaccine misinformation, and the large majority of them were from Russian bots and trolls. But the most disturbing thing is that their persona, they take on the persona of an African-American person in order to target the African-American community, knowing that, you know, we have this almost PTSD-like reaction because of the atrocities visited upon us throughout our history here in this country, having to do with medical experimentation and medical research before there was informed consent. And so all this disinformation is rooted in a certain grain of truth that preys upon our vulnerabilities in terms of our concerns about the medical establishment. So we have to be particularly vigilant because they know that we're going to pay attention. And if we as African Americans don't take an effective vaccine, should it come out, those disparities that we heard about before in terms of COVID-19 and the death rates from COVID-19, unfortunately, are only going to widen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Carlisle, Dr. Clark. Dr. Montgomery Rice, as president of a Black medical school, you know firsthand about the importance of producing Black doctors and how valuable these physicians are to helping to build trust in our community. Now, our next guest is Dr. James Hildreth. He's president and chief executive officer of Meharry Medical College. Also joining this conversation is Sterling Washington. Now, Mr. Washington is a participant in a COVID clinical trial. Dr. Hildreth, you were just appointed to an important oversight committee for the FDA. I've got about a minute and we can pick this up on the other side of a break, but just real briefly, talk to me about that role.
Can't hear you.
And make sure your mic is unmuted. I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer that question and we'll pick you up on the other side.
There's a committee of experts at the FDA that will have the responsibility for reviewing the data for vaccines, and they'll be recommending to the commissioner whether or not those vaccines are approved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. And I certainly have more questions for you as well as we begin to move through this process. And we're also going to be talking to Mr. Washington as well. So please, everyone, just kind of sit tight for a moment as we get ready to move into this break period. Stay with us as we drill down on what you need to know about the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials process and why the African-American community must have a seat at this table. This is a very critical point to make, and we want to make sure that everyone has as much information as possible. Also, we want to remind you that Dr. Rev Tuckson is kind of holding his own because he's got a lot of people who are asking him so many questions over there in the comments section. So we encourage you to continue to interact with Dr. Tuckson. I'm no better person to answer so many of those questions. I'm Harold Fisher, and we are making it plain. African Americans and the COVID-19 vaccine will be back in a bit. So again, thank you so much for staying with us as we continue to examine what you need to know about the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials process, as well as why the African American community needs to have a seat at the table on this issue. As we said earlier, I'm joined by Dr. Valerie Montgomery Rice. She is president of the Morehouse School of Medicine. And again, we want to remind you that we will be doing a special Q&A with all of our experts participating after 8 p.m. Dr. Rev Tuckson, of course, with the Black Coalition Against COVID-19 is online right now taking your questions, and you can join that conversation using the hashtag #VaccineTownHall. I want to continue our discussion with Dr. James Hildreth, President and Chief Executive Officer of Meharry Medical College in Sterling, Washington. He is a participant in a COVID-19 clinical trial. I want to go back to Dr. Hildreth for just a moment, because it's really important that you give us a more expansive discussion about why you're participating in this process and why it's so important to continue to essentially keep an eye on what's happening with the FDA.
Well, unfortunately, we've all witnessed how science has become politicized by leaders in Washington. But I'm happy to say that most of the vaccine researchers are colleagues of mine, and we're driven by a singular thing, which is to get it right. And I'm happy to say that I know with great confidence that none of them are going to let their scientific expertise and their scientific reputations be damaged by being politicized. So I have confidence that that is the case.
Do you feel a great sense of responsibility in your role right now, perhaps more than ever, considering where we are in the midst of this pandemic?
Well, I've been studying viruses for 40 years, studying HIV for 38 years. So this is something I know a great deal about. I'm also leading a historically Black institution, and Meharry and Morehouse, Drew and Howard have become trusted entities, as Dr. Montgomery Rice has pointed out. So there's a weight of responsibility that I feel. But the thing that I'm really most concerned about is there are things called immune response genes that control how well we respond to different challenges. That's best seen in our response to cancers, for example. And because of that fact, it is really imperative that we participate in clinical trials, because the only way to know that the vaccine works in us, because of those subtle differences in our immune systems, is that we participate. And the last thing we want to do is to have a vaccine approved that doesn't work in us. That would be a disaster.
Mm-hmm. Well said. I want to slide over now to Sterling, Washington. Mr. Washington, you are taking part in the effort to find the vaccine against COVID. I'm going to ask you what everyone wants to know. How are you feeling?
I actually feel fine. It's been a couple of weeks since I got the vaccine candidate or placebo, because again, it's a double-blind study that I'm in, so I don't know which one I received. And I only had some minor discomfort at the injection site for the couple of days after the injection. However, that's typical for me. I typically will get flu shots, and there was no reaction I had to this, again, vaccine candidate or placebo that differed from the typical flu shot that I receive.
Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to do this?
Well, like Dr. Hildreth said, and also Dr. Rice, I want to make sure that if there is a vaccine candidate that is proven to be effective, that it works for people across the board. So I want it to work for African Americans. I want it to work for women, for a diverse population. And if the volunteers for these particular trials are only from one or two groups, there's no guarantee that it's going to work across the board.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Rice, I know you have a bucket load of questions.
Well, I have a bucket load of questions because I really want Dr. Hildreth to share with us. Dr. Hildreth, how will we know that the vaccine is effective? Can you break that down for us? And then once we know that we have one that's effective, how will we choose to take that one versus another one?
So when it comes to vaccines, there are actually two concepts that listeners and the watchers need to know. There's efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy means the vaccine has done what we hoped it would do, which is to induce an antibody response or T cell response. That would be efficacious because the vaccine has done what we asked to do. Whether or not it's effective depends on a number of things. One of those is how many people in the population choose to accept it. In order for a vaccine to be effective, it has to achieve herd immunity in the population under consideration. And for this virus, the best estimate is that 70% of us need to be immune to this virus in order to achieve herd immunity. So the effectiveness comes from the efficaciousness of the vaccine. And then on top of that, how many people are willing to accept it? And so that, again, is why it's really important for us to get enough trust from enough people to make sure that at least 70% of the population gets vaccinated.
So if we find the best vaccine and only 20% of us choose to get vaccinated, then
right.
we are not going to achieve herd immunity.
That's
And
right.
and one of the things that we know, when everybody was talking about, should we be like Sweden and have really exposed everybody, we know that if we did that, we would have had a whole bunch more people dying.
Absolutely.
Right. And the reason that was so concerning, because if we look at the number of people who have chronic diseases and who are having deaths as a consequence of having this virus, we would have to get to millions of people dying.
Oh, yes.
Before we would get to herd immunity. So we want herd immunity, but we want it with the vaccine.
Okay, can we chat about that for just a moment? Because this is just in the natural flow of this conversation. We've heard this term herd immunity 3 times in less than 3 minutes. And this is a perfect time, Dr. Hildreth, to try to bring some clarity with it, because we also may have heard two nights ago, President Trump made the reference to herd mentality. That was a misspeak, certainly. But it's that kind of thing that can be confusing to people. So can you give us kind of, the cliff notes on what that is, Dr. Hildreth?
So typically when we get exposed to a virus or bacterium or anything else that can elicit an immune response, we generate what are called memory cells, that the next time we see that entity, that virus, that bacteria, our immune response makes a robust response to that thing, and we're protected. So there's a natural way to achieve herd immunity, which is to let enough members of the population become infected and recover, because they would presumably be immune to whatever that is. But if it has a fatality rate of 5%, 10%, that means that in allowing the natural process of herd immunity to occur, many, many, many people have to die to achieve that. And so as Dr. Montgomery Rice said, the preferred mechanism for herd immunity in modern times is not to watch millions of people die, is to give millions of people a vaccine so they can achieve herd immunity.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Mr. Washington, did anyone discuss with you possible side effects?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The trial staff, when I went for the first intake, if you will, described possible side effects to me. And also, they were very open about saying that if at any time I decided not to participate anymore in the trial, I could drop out without any negative consequences to that.
Excellent.
Excellent. Mr. Washington, I would like to know what was the one thing that they said to you that gave you fear? Was there anything they told you that gave you hesitation? Is this the right thing for me to do?
Not really. I mean, the possible symptoms they described were things like fatigue, headaches. I think one that stood out was swelling in the underarm glands. I was like, oh, that's interesting. But nothing that really elicited fear.
Okay, good. And so, that sort of indicates, Harold, that perhaps he had an engagement with a group of people that he actually trusted, that they actually broke down the information in a way that he could understand it. And then hopefully they're continuing to make themselves available to answer your questions, even if it occurs at odd times of the evening or night. We have to have hotlines available, and they have a 24/7 hotline that you can call and actually have your questions answered. And there was these things that sort of happened in the middle of the night. Maybe he might start to feel some swelling somewhere. We have to make sure that they have access to care. And so, as I talked about earlier, the messenger matters and the message matters. And then the follow-up is really important. So it sounds like you're having a good experience. And that's what we, as the 4 historically Black medical colleges, want all of the participants to have. And so one of the things that we've done, we've sort of developed this pledge that now if you go to each of our websites, and we're talking about what we are committed to, and we are really committed to ensuring that there's respect for all the people who are participating in these trials, that there's voluntary consent, that people are voluntarily agreeing to participate in the trial. And one of the things that I really liked that we said was that our decisions to recommend participation in clinical trials, including vaccine trials, will be always informed by rigorous science, carried out under the international rules governing safe and ethical conduct of research. And we have this on our website. It's about protecting our communities. It's about listening and addressing their concerns, and then getting them to participate in the trial and following them all the way through.
Well, that's
what we are committed to.
And that brings me to this next question, Mr. Washington. I'm curious, how long is this process? Kind of give us a brief follow through. Is this one injection? Is there a pill, 2 injections? How frequently? Talk to me about that if you can.
Yeah, so it's so the trial itself, it's going to be like a 25-month process, but there are 2 injections given about a month apart. I had my first one August 28th, and then the next one is late this month. And there's an app actually that I downloaded where for the first week I kept track of things like my temperature, recorded any symptoms that I felt, and then I get called once a week just to sort of check in. They're doing follow-up, and after the second visit where I'll get the second in-person visit where I'll get either the second injection of the vaccine candidate or the placebo, there are going to be a battery of tests there. They'll take blood samples, saliva samples, and actually before I took the test, I was given a COVID test as well, just to make sure I wasn't already exposed.
25 months.
Yeah, and during that period of time, they'll be doing regular follow-ups, regular phone calls to me. And then at the end of that period, I'll find out if I actually received the vaccine candidate or the placebo. But at that point, it's, they don't want any psychosomatic symptoms, of course. So if they, and from their end, it's a double-blind study so that they're not,
I don't know either,
for example, disclosing any information that might create a psychosomatic response in me. So they want real reactions based on what I am experiencing.
Are you being tested for COVID-19 also during this process?
Yes.
How frequently?
I think at least twice, because every time I go in to get the vaccine candidate or placebo, they will be conducting a COVID-19 test.
Does that sound about right, Dr. Hildreth, based on your experience?
Yes. So our colleague is involved in what's called a Primeboost regimen where you give the vaccine one time to sort of get the immune system's attention, and it makes a primary response. What we really want is a secondary response when the immune system is expansive in generating memory cells. That way, the next time you see the virus, the immune system is fully ready to respond and eliminate it. And I want to emphasize something that Dr. Rice said, which is that science matters a great deal. And for example, we are doing something to get the immune system's attention. When the immune system triggers, certain things happen. We get fevers, we get muscle aches. There are other things that happen when the immune system is engaged, which means that people should not be surprised if they get a vaccine and these things happen. It's just the science of the immune system. And that's why I think science is really important in helping people understand that we know what we're doing. This has been done many times before. And the other thing to point out is that when you have 30,000 people in a trial, it would not be unexpected that some of them are going to get sick from other things.
Yes.
But there is a tendency to think that it was the vaccine, when in fact, if there are 30,000 people just living their lives, some of them are going to get sick from other things that had nothing to do with the vaccine. So these are the kinds of things that we know from the science, and that's why the science is so very important.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Hildreth. Real quick, Mr. Washington, I'm assuming that you still have to adhere to, social distancing, wearing a mask and stuff like that. So they're not trying to.
I've got my
they're not trying to put you in a position where let's see what happens.
Mr. Harold, he could have the placebo also. Remember that.
Yeah.
So we don't want to take any chances here. We want the three: wash your hands, wear your mask, watch your distance. Okay, don't forget that. Okay, that is really important.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and certainly, good luck to you, Mr. Washington and Dr. Hildreth. Thank you so very, very much. This is another really critical piece, Dr. Montgomery Rice, and I'm sure you can relate to this. The Black church has played a really pivotal part in our community. And it's a place we often turn to, not only for spiritual guidance and direction, but also as a place to help us make other important decisions in our day-to-day lives. Well, our final guest for tonight he's a leader in the community. Rev Dr Kendrick Curry is the pastor of the Pennsylvania Avenue Baptist Church right here in Washington, D.C. But Reverend Curry is also the PhD in chemical engineering. Dr. Curry, you're a scientist. You are also a pastor. So what information and sources of information do you need to be able to guide your congregation through this coronavirus pandemic?
Well, thank you so very much for having me on. I think this is just a wonderful discussion over these last two nights. What we're actually doing in having this town hall and having this discussion is very relevant to what I need for my congregation. I've been gleaning day in and day out about this particular information, and I'm very much interested in the questions that are being raised. In particular, should I take the vaccine? Is this vaccine going to be effective and safe for me? Does it work? And if so, how well? Those are the questions we need answered. And so that I will be able to go back to a congregation and begin to say, okay, let's consider the science. We understand with our faith, let's consider the science, and then begin to understand better more about things such as how this thing is spreading in community, the capacity and the community engagement we need. We know that. We've been told to wear masks. We've been told to wash our hands. We've been told to socially distance. So now what we have to do is do more to begin to share with congregations and people in the community to say, well, look, if this is safe, and I'm hearing from these great physicians and these great leaders that are from our medical schools that represent the HBCU banner, then we want to be able to hear from them and have their surrogates in the context of community. We want to be a part of the plan with regard to having them share with the churches in their community or houses of worship. And then we see the trusted figures in the communities. And as such, then we will be able to begin to move forward and do some of the things that are necessary to make sure that people are comfortable. But right now, people are not comfortable. I talk to folk day in and day out about this. And the thing that this revolves around is the idea of trust. We've heard trust over the last couple of days. And one of the things is we need to begin to unpack this whole idea and this notion of trust. First of all, to trust you, I'm making myself vulnerable to you. I have to have some faith. I have faith in God, but I also have to have a faith in you. And so that vulnerability is an area that seems to be something that we need to talk a little bit more about. Another thing is we need to be very clear and honest. We need some truth telling about what the impact are. We've heard a lot about informed consent and voluntary consent, and I think that's right. But we need to be able to be honest and talk to folk about, just as we did with our previous guest who's going through a trial, what's actually happening. Nothing that is important in building trust is this whole piece around empathy. We need to understand the pre-existing conditions as well as the context from which somebody else comes. And when we're able to do that, now we'll be better able to begin to talk about this whole idea of trusting. So I've been vulnerable. I make myself vulnerable. You're honest. You have empathy. But the last thing I will say in that regard is you need to communicate. And when you do that, you need to have things that are not lost in translation. So you need to be able to communicate from everyone that is from the hip hop generation on to those who are baby boomers and beyond in the language that they need to hear it. And we need to see the authorities, those trusted figures who can provide that. And I think when we're beginning to talk about what I need that sort of data. I need to see you. I need to know that you care. I need to know that you are believing in this thing. And at the end of the day, I just want you to be able to tell me and look me in my eye face to face with the data in hand and let me know that everything is going to be all right.
I did want to drill down a little bit more on this particular issue. The Black community has a long memory. Okay. And if you don't believe that, you just look at the comments that we're seeing here tonight from people who are watching online. And yet, how do you balance that long and difficult history and memory with the fact that if we were not included and then there was a vaccine, then the complaint would be, well, nobody asked us. How do you balance that?
You know, as we begin to think about that, you know, the way we balance it is, one, I think it gets back to partly the truth telling that we have to deal with. The truth of the matter is we need to be participatory in clinical trials. Yeah. We need to be participatory in such a way that we find ourselves engaged in them so that we know the right dosage, we know that they're going to be effective and all of that. But that has to be balanced with that memory that you're talking about. And it's unfortunate that we've had some egregious abuses in the past. You know, everybody mentions Tuskegee, but we can go all the way back to slavery and look at all sorts of things where there have been abuses. So to begin to overcome those sorts of things, we have to begin to deal with the owning up of, yes, we've had challenges before, and we've had this issue where we've not had implied consent or voluntary consent, but now we're coming to you because this is a matter of emergency. People are literally dying. They're dying at a greater clip in the Black communities and in Latinx communities, et cetera, than any other community. So now we need to really begin to really focus on how we're going to solve this particular problem. We have our faith, but we must go and use the faith that we have to understand that God has given these doctors, and it helps us to recognize beyond a shadow of a doubt that when we pull this together, we will be able to have trusted faces and trusted people that help balance what is necessary so that we can begin to move forward. I really want us to understand this. For our vulnerability of our people, in the context of the Black church, we need to hear some honesty. We need to know that you care, and we need you to communicate and keep it real. Mm-hmm. As much as you do that, you need to tell me why this is important, and really have a solid communication with me.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Montgomery Rice.
You know, Reverend Curry, what I've been most excited about, I'm a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and have had the opportunity. I serve on the Return to Church Committee. And so every week we have, every week we're having a meeting about, is it time? Is it time? And I keep saying, no, 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 because we got to get the infection rate down to a certain level in the city. And then we got to understand who our demographics are and what would happen if we come back all together, because there's no way we're not going to hug each other and fellowship. And so what I believe that we've done in our community is to be very, very transparent, direct, and clear about the why. And now we want to extend that level of trust, because we've modeled the right behavior, into telling people about, okay, what are your options for testing? What are your options for enrolling in clinical trials, and why you must do it? So you are, I think, right on. And I think that, we will not be successful in enrolling the number of people in clinical trials if the faith-based community is not with us. And so we want to continue to be the resource that we need to be to get the right information, and to have you all shepherd that information for us in a way that makes it plain.
Yeah, I'm excited that you said that, because that's absolutely positively what's necessary. The houses of worship must shepherd this and make sure. One of the things we've done here, working with the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, is really have a testing site at the church. Mm-hmm. One of the important things is that you not only have a trusted voice. I believe Dr. Rice, you said that literally you needed a messenger as well as the message. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've tried to do is to not only have the messenger and the message, but we've also had the person as well as the place. And so when we deal with this person in place here at the church, we've been doing tested, and we tested maybe 80 to up to 80 to 100 persons a week or more. And on some weekends at other parts of testing, we've done over 200 walk-up tests. And I want you to understand that shows the community that a trusted entity, even before testing, could be done. And I think that lays the groundwork for exactly what you're talking about, so that when we talk about doing these clinical trials or having these interventions, then we can begin to really say, you remember we were testing. You remember we were providing you with your results. We were sitting with you. We were engaging in care of your soul as well as your physical health. And it is then that we would be able to find ourselves telling the others, say, hey, why don't we consider this clinical trial? We can have open meetings. The HBCU medical schools can provide toolkits for the community. We can push that out in the community. And now we start to build trust, because it seems like we're walking hand in hand alongside one another.
Have you started having those conversations with your congregation right now? I've got about a minute. Yeah.
The answer is yes, and they are very difficult conversations. Conversations regarding pre-existing conditions, conversations regarding literally everything that you've outlined. But one of the things that folk are saying more than anything else, I don't want to be the guinea pig and take the first virus. But I'm also saying to them, if we don't have those who are willing to do what is necessary, then how will we find the cure with the right dosage, with the vaccine that has the right dosage, etc.?
We also have to remind them that they don't want to be the last either, okay? They don't want to be the last, okay? They don't want to be the last. And so, I mean, and again, we would not, as the 4 historically Black medical colleges, be recommending this. All the doctors who are involved in this network, all the community leaders who are involved in this network, believe me, they are pushing us. They are forcing us, asking us questions on things we hadn't even thought about. And they are making us be held, they're holding us accountable to getting the right answers for the community.
Dr. Rice, I need to take a quick break. We have to leave our radio audience, and I want to invite you to join us at WHUR.com on Facebook or YouTube. And our panel of experts will be here to answer your questions. This is a special edition of the Daily Drum in partnership with the Black Coalition Against COVID-19. I'm Harold Fisher. Join the conversation right now online using the hashtag #VaccineTownHall. Thank you for staying with us for this online conversation, Making It Plain, a special 2-night town hall on African Americans and the COVID-19 vaccine. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Harold Fisher, and this is our part 2 of our special 2-night town hall on African Americans and the COVID-19 vaccine, Making It Plain. We want to continue with Dr. Valerie Montgomery Rice. She is president of the Morehouse School of Medicine, and we have a packed house of experts joining us to answer your questions. And we want to make sure that we arm you with the information and the resources you need to safely guide you through this pandemic. Lots of information to unpack tonight on the clinical trials process and the development of a vaccine. And we're going to start with our questions tonight. We have, as you can see, we have all of our experts in, and we want to continue to thank our experts for participating, as well as the many people who are commenting, yay or nay as it relates to this COVID-19 vaccine as we prepare to continue researching it and hopefully developing it as soon as possible. Dr. Tuckson, you've been busy. You've been very, very busy. I've been kind of watching what's been happening with you and the people who have been asking questions and making comments. Talk to me about what you're hearing.
Yeah, here's a couple of quick questions that we can go through. I'll just start with people are very interested about, from you, Mr. Washington, about whether or not you were compensated or being compensated for participating in the clinical trial.
Yes, I actually am. I didn't realize that I would be until that very first in-person meeting where we reviewed the informed consent, and I was told at that point that I would be compensated.
Great. And then, Harold, there's a question for Dr. Hildreth regarding whether or not people who are in the clinical trial could also have access to the flu vaccine. Can you do both at the same time?
Can't hear you.
Yeah, make sure that your microphone is on, Dr. Hildreth. Thank you so much.
It's a great question, and it's highly recommended that you get the flu vaccine because we're likely to have a very significant flu season. And the likelihood of having both flu and COVID-19 in high levels in the communities is kind of scary. So we're recommending that everyone this year get a flu vaccine.
But I think the question also, Dr. Hildreth, just to be sure, was if you are a participant in a clinical trial, can you, which is studying the COVID vaccine, can you simultaneously, and by the way, there's also, and since you've got that, and as Harold takes some of the other questions, there were also questions about, you used some words like the immune system and T cell. There are a lot of folks who are trying to understand what the immune system is and what are T cells. So maybe you could do both of those.
So our bodies are equipped with I think an amazing system. I'm an immunologist, so I'm biased, but the immune system is a system of organs and cells in our bodies that keep us protected. Every day we get exposed to microbes we don't realize we've been exposed to because our immune system shuts them down. but it has two major components, the adaptive immune system does. T cells and antibodies. Antibodies physically bind to viruses and neutralize them. T cells can kill the cells that are making the viruses. And normally it takes both of these two cell types working together to completely eliminate a virus. And so the vaccines that are being developed, though, primarily are focused on making antibody responses. But that's what I'm referring to when I speak about T cells and B cells.
Great. Harold, there was another question which people are asking about, and that is they're wondering about how these clinical trials are going to be marketed to the community, and who will do that.
Wow, that is a really good question. Dr. Montgomery Rice, you have thoughts on that?
Yes, so in fact, we're having some discussions about that. So you've probably seen some advertisement about it. There is another panel that the NIH put together. They took a group of Black scientists, a group of Latinx scientists, a group of scientists who work with geriatrics, a group of scientists who work with veterans, and the Navajo community. And they have us also on panels, and we are reviewing all of the clinical trials. Now, we're not reviewing them for approval because that's what this has already happened for them to be in a phase 3 study. But we are looking at all of the information that is being used and developed to recruit, looking at the consent forms. Are they in the plain enough English, a language for people to understand? Is it in multiple different languages? And what is your inclusion and exclusion criteria? And then the other part that we're looking at is what type of media are they using for advertising, and understanding that that needs to be very diverse. And so there are the pharmaceutical companies who are hosting the trial are primarily funding that that work. However, we all will get as a part of our budget when we start to be sites for the trial to actually market for the trials also.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We have a question now from the many people who are participating in this discussion online. Charles Zeta Spearman says, will it be mandatory to take it? Dr. Tuckson, that is such a critical question, because this isn't like, necessarily the flu as it relates to adults. We are in the midst of a pandemic. This is a public health emergency. And so I think that is a critical question that needs to be looked at.
It is a very legitimate question. And no, there is no way that anybody can force anyone to take a medication into their body. This is not something that can be mandatory. That being said, if in fact we are fortunate enough to find that there are vaccines that will work safely and effectively, then it would certainly be a decision that a reasonable person would make, that it would be important to make, not only for your own health, but for those around you. Consider the alternative. I hope that you are not a person that would want to consider living the rest of the next several years of your life wearing a mask all the time, social distancing and so forth. There has to be a way to stomp this thing out. We have to end it. So while it would not be mandatory, it would be certainly expected that reasonable people would take the vaccine, again, with the provision that it has been tested well, proven safe, and proven effective.
But let me drill down a little bit on that, Dr. Tuckson, and certainly anyone who wants to jump in, because I think that here's the context. If you are a child in a public school system, you have to have MMR, measles, mumps, rubella. As we know, mumps, very, very contagious. Measles, very, very contagious. And in any public school system, if you don't have that vaccine, because it is a vaccine, that you can't come to class. And I think that's the context that Ms. Spearman was asking, not just for adults, but again, for children.
I understand. I'll let my colleagues also get a chance to respond, but I think that the issue is that we are not at that point yet. And what we do not know and do not have is information that will tell us that the vaccines that that hopefully will be approved, we don't know how overwhelmingly effective they will be, and we don't know all we need to know about any potential side effects. So it's way too early for something like that. And what I want to be very cautious about is introducing into the conversation a sense of an overreaching governmental action that would mandate and force people to put things into their body at this point. It is way too early for that, but perhaps one of my colleagues may have a different point of view.
Yeah, Dr. Clark, what do you think?
Well, I think as we consider whether this is ethical to make it mandatory, because I think that's really what we're talking about, we have to weigh, as anything, the risks and the benefits. First of all, as Dr. Tuckson said, we have to know whether it works. We have to know how safe it is. So in order to make that risk-benefit analysis, you have to have all the facts in front of you. Even in a school situation where it's mandated, there are certain exceptions that can be made within the context of a child going to school. And there's also the option of homeschooling. So I think there are always going to be ways that even in a situation where it's mandatory, which I really sincerely doubt that that's going to be the case, that there will be legitimate reasons for not abiding with a mandate that are medically based.
Okay, thank you for that. Dr. Carlisle, I want to bring you into this next question. This is from Melanie Alston. She says, her mother is 64 years old with high blood pressure and cholesterol and wants to participate in the COVID trial vaccine through her doctor's office. mRNA-1273 phase 3 study. You're going to help me with this again. As I said, I'm still working on my medical degree. Given her age and health, is it safe for her to participate? So help me with that. First of all, Dr. Carlisle, mRNA-1273, and then if you could follow up with an answer to the question.
I think Dr. Carlisle step away. I think he had to step away.
Oh, okay.
And so
who else would like to
look at this? So mRNA-1273 is that is probably one of the trials, and that is the code that they're using to describe the trial. I think I know which one it is, but I don't want to be incorrect on that. But the most important thing is that all of these studies have inclusion and exclusion criteria. And we know, you all, that people who have chronic diseases, hypertension, diabetes, etc., are the people who are having the greatest complications when they are infected with the virus. And so those diseases, to my knowledge, are not contraindications for the reasons for not getting the vaccine, because we are expecting that people with chronic diseases are going to be exposed. And so we do have to understand if there are unexpected side effects that occur when people have controlled diabetes, controlled hypertension, etc. Now, if you are a patient who does not have controlled, meaning your diabetes is not controlled, your hypertension is not controlled, we would want you to get those things controlled first, meaning on the appropriate medications, before we would recommend you get into any type of clinical trial.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Allison Matthews says that mRNA-1273 is the Moderna vaccine trial. Yeah, well, that's what we've got doctors checking in too. So, so we appreciate that, Dr. Matthews. Carmen Samuels Jackson. She says, Black people should not have a seat at this table. We need an expanded lens when it comes to health and healing. Can you speak to innate immunity and immune support? There's a lot to that question. Let me first start with Dr. Hildreth, your thoughts about that, and then certainly Dr. Curry, Reverend Dr. Curry, you can chime in as well.
So the innate immune response is usually not sufficient to deal with an envelope virus like SARS-CoV-2. The innate immune system is designed for other kinds of organisms we get exposed to, and there's no evidence whatsoever that the innate immune response alone can deal with a virus. So with all due respect to my colleague, it's not expected nor predicted that the innate immune system alone is going to protect us from this virus. What does that are antibodies and T cells, and the way you get those is with a vaccine.
She also
may I jump in on that just for a moment? I think it's also very important, as was said at the very beginning, that COVID-19 has unveiled the health disparities in our communities. And so this is an opportunity for us as the Black community to focus on our health and to help to decrease those health disparities through focusing on nutrition, proper sleep, adequate amount of water, adequate amount of movement every day, and of course, decreasing our responses to stress, the stresses that are in our community by faith-based methods, exercise, hobbies, etc. Because it is important to build the health of our bodies against whatever we may come in contact with, and to also decrease our risk profile for having a severe response to the COVID-19 virus.
And thank you for that. You know, Reverend Curry, I'm a little surprised at that last comment from the online participant saying that Black people should not have a seat at this table, because historically we have been marginalized in so many other ways. And in this particular case, this now more than ever is a time when not only must we have a seat at the table, but we should be sitting at the head of the table and creating other tables and the like.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think now we have to have a diverse view of perspectives with regard to how to tackle a given matter. Yes, I do believe in what Dr. Clark just said, that there are faith-based methods. We need to deal with those things which are in really that we are in need of, nutrition and proper diet and what have you. But it also points to the other issues in our communities where we have food insecurities and other matters. Mm-hmm. But I will say, at this season and juncture in life, we must look at all of the options. And I would say that we literally need to have those who are Black and like brown and other really at the heads of the tables, so that we can begin to sort of forge our own destiny and understand in a better way how we can help heal our people and be responsible for all of the things that are necessary, so that we are better people, healthy people, and get past some of the other conditions we have in our communities.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ramona Scruggs Hale. And she's asking, can you speak to the reason the AstraZeneca trial was placed on hold? And we covered this yesterday, and I think it's a very appropriate question to ask again today. Dr. Tuckson, we covered that yesterday. Do you want to respond to her question about the AstraZeneca trial?
What we have learned is that this particular patient had an inflammation of the lining of the spinal canal, which caused them to have some difficulty in walking. And so that is the reason that it was postponed, and that was brought up yesterday. I don't know what the status of that is today, and maybe one of our guests has followed that more carefully, whether or not that trial has resumed or not yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yes. So yes, it has resumed. The individual was released from the hospital. She was a woman in the United Kingdom, and the trial has resumed in the United Kingdom. I don't think it's resumed here as yet.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, Dr. Clark, in that, and we discussed this yesterday, that this is not unusual when you're talking about clinical trials, and how sometimes things happen. And
well, Well, the reason why we have clinical trials is to understand, is the vaccine safe and is it effective? And so that's what the trial is answering. So there will probably be some side effects in the trial. And as you heard Mr. Montgomery explain, that those things were explained to him up front. And then you volunteer understanding what those risks are. And based on your motivation, a lot of times most people's motivation is really to be able to help the community. You're actually volunteering to potentially take on some risk. Transverse myelitis is very rare. It's a very rarely seen in vaccines. It's more often seen with viral infections themselves, but it is something to know, just as some of the other side effects, which Mr. Montgomery mentioned, that were explained up front.
Thank you so much for that. Our next question, Nicholas St. Fleur, he's back. He participated yesterday, and thank you so much for joining us for a second day. Are any of the vaccine trials close to recruiting the necessary number of Black Americans in their trials? Are any of the vaccine trials particularly impressive to you with their recruitment numbers? Dr. Hildreth, your thoughts about it?
I think that the vaccine trials, those leading the trials, are making every effort to recruit minorities, but they're not having much success. And it gets back to issues we've already spoken about, the trust issues. Here in Nashville, we've been contacted by Vanderbilt to try to help them get more minorities into their trial. They're doing the Moderna vaccine, and they're having a difficult time getting African Americans enrolled. But of course, we're doing our own enrollments, so we're going to try to help them. But my focus is enrolling participants in our own trials.
Do we know enough for you to say, this looks good, or are we just, is it just too early, Dr. Hildreth?
Well, the Moderna enrollment is moved pretty quickly. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but I'm told that it's somewhere around 5%.
It's about 5 to 7% Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson may be a little bit better than that. But here's the challenge. The challenge is they got to have the trusted entity to get Black people and brown people to enroll in a trial. And so one of the things I'm pretty comfortable with is with the success that the 4 historically Black medical schools have had, is that we will be more successful. And we will be more successful because we will share the information in a way that I think is going to make people more comfortable. As well, we will make sure that we are readily available to address those fears up front, you all, and to not brush them off, but to say, you know what, you are correct. Tuskegee was horrible. All the things that have happened in the past is horrible. But let's talk about what's happening right now in our community. Let's talk about every one of us know 1 or 2 people who've gotten COVID, and we know somebody who elderly who has passed from COVID. And so we have to look at this as a preventive strategy to prevent an untoward number of people from dying from COVID-19, because that is what's happening. And so we have to take control of this. And the only way we're going to do that is to have a vaccine that is effective.
And, Dr. Montgomery Rice, and this also, in mentioning, this has disproportionately impacted seniors, not just American seniors, but seniors all around the world. But here in the DMV, we've lost some young people here. One of the more high profile cases was a young Black woman who worked in, I believe it was a Walmart or a grocery store or something like that. And she was in her 20s. And, that's just, one example of these things that are happening. And so it's, and it's not just the elderly that are getting very sick or dying, but we are also having, people who are normally healthy with, none of the comorbid situations. They don't have diabetes. They don't have high blood pressure. They're not overweight. And even, though some of them have recovered, even, one of my frat brothers who is extremely healthy, vegan, fitness guy, he got terribly sick. He recovered. And so the impact of COVID-19 is extremely expansive. And one other point, and Dr. Tuxson, you may be aware of this also, that, George Washington University has reported just this week, a couple of days ago, that it has exceeded its target for Black participants. And I don't know whether or not that has to do with the university or the fact that we are in Washington, D.C., or exactly what that's about, but they have done well.
They have done well, and in part because, yes, we are in D.C., but also they've done a very good job of community outreach along the lines that Valerie Montgomery Rice has suggested. They also have asked and reached out to Howard University to be helpful in the same lines that Dr. Hildreth and Vanderbilt are doing. So we're starting to see partnerships across the board, but they are doing better. And also, I will give GW very much credit. They have a very active group of people working on the ground in communities prior to the vaccine trials. So they had an infrastructure to draw upon. And that, Harold, raises a question that I need to ask on behalf of some of the people online. In particular, maybe this goes to Valerie Montgomery Rice and Dr. Curry. They asked, should Black celebrities be involved in marketing these clinical trials? And secondly, what is the role of community-based organizations in enrolling people in clinical trials?
So I will say that yes, Black celebrities should be involved in marketing and clinical trials. We have been working with celebrities to do a mask up campaign so that we can encourage people to wear their mask, watch their distance, and wash their hands. We know that we have to meet people where they are. And we know that there are different levels of engagement that is required for different ages of people. And so I am very comfortable with celebrities being involved in not only the marketing, but also the vaccine trials themselves, for them also coming in and being a volunteer for the trial. So yes, I think it's very important. And then community-based organizations, we will not reach our enrollment of Black and brown people if we don't have a strong level of engagement from our federally qualified health centers and our community organizations for being that voice that can translate the information to the community in a way that sometimes we cannot, because we don't know all of the hidden fears that people really do have about these trials.
Mm-hmm. And
if I could jump in just right. Number one, yes, celebrities, absolutely. So they need to leverage celebrity so that we can get this thing done and people can be have a vaccine and be vaccinated. But let me just say this regarding community-based organizations. What we've done with the work with Howard University Hospital and the Black Coalition Against COVID-19 is to have a testing center, as I mentioned, in the church. You can't even begin to imagine the significance of having a trusted entity like Howard University Hospital and the Black Coalition Against COVID in like a house of worship. And that becomes a very significant partnership and relationship that then moves us to a point where we can have seniors as well as young people that understand that that community entity is going to not do me wrong and they will do no harm in helping me move to where I am. Likewise, let me say about DW as well. They have a ground game that is second to none. They have done that work with preparing an infrastructure. I've worked with them on a number of different projects, from even looking at telemedicine in the context of the church to finding out and looking at a variety of different things to talk about e-health and other things. So the stronger we have community connected with our institutions such as hospitals and our doctors, etc. Now we will be able to go even further into the community and deal with situations that we really need to contend with.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Lisa Fitzpatrick, which of the HBCU medical schools have trial sites? Dr. Montgomery Rice, you've spoken about that. Please share that with us, please.
So all of us have been are being vetted for sites, and so Morehouse School of Medicine and Meharry, I know, are two that have been approved. Howard also has been approved, and so now the sponsors are bringing forth their protocols to us, and we're vetting through which of the protocols we will start with. And
how long do you think it'll take?
Pardon me?
How long do you think it'll take before that process is active for the HBCU medical schools?
So we expect to start our first trial probably about the third week in October.
That's not far. That's
not at all. And Dr. Hildreth may have a different timeline because they were a little bit ahead of us.
Yes, we're going to start early next month in October.
Okay.
Hey, Harold, before you go to the next one, Dr. Hildreth is going to have to leave, but there was a question that is relevant to him from our colleagues, the people that are watching on blackdoctor.org. And the question from blackdoctor.org participant was, are any of the docs on the line here going to be involved, be participants in clinical trials? I think, Dr. Hildreth, you may have an answer for that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to be the first one to get the vaccine at Meharry. And two of my colleagues at Dillard and Xavier, as you know, they've already taken part in a clinical trial.
Yeah. So and definitely will be a participant. I definitely will be a participant. Yes.
And Dr. Lisa Fitzpatrick, who asked the previous question, is a community physician who I know also is involved currently in a clinical trial. So the answer to our questioner from blackdoctor.org is the answer is yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Brenda Tomlinson, thank you for this informative town hall meeting. Can you address the ingredients in the vaccine trial and the concern for mercury? Wow, that's... I
don't know that I know the answer to that. The person who probably could have told us that just got off the phone. Well, Dr. Hildreth probably can do that, but maybe Dr. Clark knows.
I don't know whether mercury is in this vaccine. Mercury is generally used as a preservative in vaccines in the form of thimerosal. And a lot of people the whole misinformation on social media around mercury and autism and vaccines and autism, that's where the concern around mercury comes from. But there are thimerosal-free vaccine options for the flu. And so I would imagine, as I said, I'm not sure about the COVID-19 vaccine, but I would imagine that there are going to be thimerosal-free versions of the COVID-19 vaccine because of that concern.
So help me with this, Dr. Clark, because before 3 seconds ago, I would not have known to ask about that. And, and I say that, partially joking, but the reality is, for myself, I take the flu shot. I haven't missed a flu shot in 30 years. If I don't, okay, when I've gotten the flu, then I've gotten pneumonia. I get very sick. I don't play with it. If you don't want to do it, that's your thing. But me, when it's time for the flu, okay, I get it in. I don't fool around with it. But I haven't had my shot yet. I'm going to probably get it in a few weeks. But do I need to say to my pharmacist, excuse me, I need to ask, what is it, thimerosal? Do I need to write that?
So I want to be clear, because I was trying to explain that it was linked to the misinformation about vaccines and autism. There is really no evidence or scientific basis for it, but because of the concerns that have come up from various individuals, there is a option to have a thimerosal-free version, but it is not based on any scientific evidence that it causes any problems.
And Harold, let me double down on Dr. Clark's point and your statement. If there was ever a year when you needed to get the flu vaccine, this is the year. Just imagine what is getting ready to happen in this country. We have an already extraordinary high level of COVID vaccine, of COVID virus infection throughout our communities, which is, by the way, going to go up because we're in the colder season now and people are going to be congregating indoors. That's going to be higher, combined with the seasonal flu, together having a cacophony of new insults throughout our community. The emergency rooms are going to be challenged, doctors are going to be challenged, and people are going to be nervous because the symptoms of the flu are so similar in many cases to the symptoms of this COVID vaccine. So we would have to double down and say, if you ever were going to take the flu vaccine, this is the year, and stop worrying about all these anti-vaxxers who are trying to prevent you from doing what you need to do to protect your own life.
Mr. Washington, prior to this broadcast, this program, what kind of conversations have you had, with your friends, with your family about this process, and what was their reaction when you've shared this with them, if you had?
Yes. So I've shared it actually with a limited number of family members and friends, just because I know how some will react or anticipate how some would react. And it's been mostly supportive. People have said some things like, "Oh, be careful," or "You should watch out." But I do know enough. There are institutional review boards for vaccine trials. I do have some familiarity with it. I used to work for a nonprofit years ago, a wonderful nonprofit that was trying to encourage people to participate in phase 1 HIV vaccine trials. So I do have some knowledge of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. So I knew that there were mechanisms in place to protect me as a vaccine trial participant.
Mm-hmm. And also, as we said earlier, talking about 25 months, that's 2 years and a month. What impact, if any, has this had on your work life, your personal life? Because I don't know what you do professionally, and forgive me for that, but do you have to take a day off from work, or do you have to make special arrangements, to address some of the things that are required by this trial?
So no, none of those are necessary. I actually am at the George Washington University trial site, and they gave me a number of times from which to choose. So I think my second appointment will be at 8 a.m. in the morning, especially so that I can leave there and start my work day. And I work for a startup company that has a water pipe maintenance device. It's a water conditioning device that prevents the formation of rust scale slime and biofilm in water pipes. But that's I did inform my work colleagues that I was doing the vaccine trial, and they were fully supportive and very, very encouraging, and said, thank you for doing that. That's amazing.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Bobby Banks, what are your thoughts about the balancing the push for participation in vaccine trials and the push for universal testing in the same communities? Dr. Montgomery Rice, your thoughts about that?
For pushing the balance and the push for participating in trials?
Yes.
In the same community. I think you need both of them. So universal testing, meaning that everybody should be tested. I think, yes, everyone needs to have access to testing, and the testing needs to be as often as people need to have access to testing. So I think you need to push that, and I think we need to push the vaccine trials. And so to me, they are not opposites, they're actually complementary. Once you get into the vaccine trial, as Mr. Washington said, you will actually be tested. And probably, I don't know what the frequency is, but most of them are testing at least 2 to 3 times, and they still are asking you to use all the precautions because we don't know that you're not going to get infected. And so we're still going to be tested, and we definitely need more testing in the community. We definitely need more testing in the community.
Can I just address that word push? I want it to be clear that tonight we're not here to push an agenda.
Right.
We're here to give a balanced view and balanced information so that people can make their own informed decisions. There's a perception, I think, that Black people are being asked specifically and the only group that's being solicited, quote unquote, to participate in these vaccine trials, and that's not the case. The reality of the situation is that let's say there are 30,000 people in the Moderna trial, for example, that they're trying to recruit to participate in the trial. Young white people have been volunteering at a huge rate. They're already recruited 23,000 out of that 30,000. So they didn't really need to necessarily ask the white community. They're already doing it. So therefore, they need to go to groups that are underrepresented in that 23,000 that they've already reached. That includes African Americans, Latino people, Indigenous people, people with chronic diseases, elderly people. And so all those individuals need to be fully represented so that whatever conclusions come out of this trial, it can be broadly generalized to in the entire population. You can't take information from just young white people and claim that it's going to be applicable to everyone. So I hope people don't take away from this that we're trying to push an agenda. We're trying to give a balanced picture of the importance of vaccine participation so that you can make the decision for yourself.
And I think the other part of this that's so important is we actually don't want to be left behind, which in so many times we are left behind when there are great cancer therapies out there or for newer therapies. I think about it, and I wish Dr. Hildreth was still here. When HIV, antiviral drugs for HIV were discovered, it was white gay men who were able to access those therapies at a rate that was 10 times that of Black people. Yet we had the highest level or morbidity and mortality. And when that occurred, when they got access to those drugs before we did, guess what happened? Our rates of mortality compared to them increased even more. So we widened the gap. And so what we're trying to make sure of you all is that we don't get left behind. And the only way we cannot get left behind is that we participate. And it is voluntary, but it is controlling our own destiny.
No, go ahead, Dr. Tuxton.
No, there was a question online partly related to this from, again, the people that are watching through blackdoctor.org. They wanted to know if any of you know, given how much the death rate has been for African Americans from COVID and how high it's been and how often we are infected by it, is our survival from this disease the same as for the rest of the country? Or in other words, even though we're getting it more, are we more susceptible to dying from the disease? Do we know than other people, or simply is it just so many more of us are getting infected by the disease?
Dr. Clark?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. So our death rate is 3.7 times more on average than Caucasians. For Hispanics, that's 3.5% higher than Caucasians. So not only are we disproportionately getting it, we are disproportionately dying from it. It's something like on average, 1,000 people are dying a day. For African Americans, that's 250 people a day. That's like a plane load of people going down. And so I think, just as Dr. Montgomery Rice said, we don't want to be left behind, because if we are, that 250 people a day is going to unfortunately widen to a greater number. And we definitely do not want to see that.
Thank you so much. We had a question earlier from Dr. Allison Matthews, and she was asking, and I'll have Dr. Montgomery Rice take this. She wanted to know, what is the difference between phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? Is each phase different, or do they make changes with each escalating number?
Right. So the difference is in the phases that when we first start a trial, again, most of the time we are at a point where we do something in a cell line. We then do it in an animal, and then we get to the different clinical phases. And that first phase of it is we are testing to see, okay, we've already tested in a cell line, so we know that it sort of works. We tested in an animal, we know that it works, but we don't know the right dose necessarily to use for a human, right? And we don't know what the side effects are. So phase 1 and phase 2 gets us to the point where we're looking at safety and dosing. Okay, and we gradually began to increase the number of people who are in those trials. Once you get to phase 3 trial, you're at the point where you're saying, okay, I know it has a tolerable safety profile. Doesn't mean it doesn't have any side effects, but it has a tolerable safety profile. And it has the desired outcome, meaning that it does reduce or improve whatever you are, eliminate whatever you are trying to test for. Okay, so we have some effect. We know how effective it is to a certain degree, and we know that it's safe. And now we need to enroll a larger group of people. And we need to say, okay, now we're going to bring all comers to the trial, and we're going to look for those nuances of things that we could not have seen in a smaller cohort of people. And that's where we are with this phase 3 trial. Normally in a phase 3 trial, we would not be enrolling 30,000 people in a trial. We might be enrolling 200 to 300, 400 people, maybe a couple thousand, but not 30,000. But because we are really trying to get ahead of this virus and in control of it, we have enrolled a lot more people so that we can pick up any of these nuances in a diverse population of people so that we can know, first of all, if it's safe still, effective, and then what is the true side effect profile in a large group of people.
Thank you so much for that. Ramona Scruggs-Hale is writing, I understand that people who do not get out much and wear a mask when they do get out would not make the best study subjects. Is that true? In other words, higher risk subjects are desirable. Is that the case? Does it matter what your risk level happens to be? Your thoughts about that, Dr. Tuckson?
I think that as we just heard from Dr. Montgomery Rice, we really want a broad section of people. We want people who fit the profile that the questioner is giving, and we want people who are older people, younger people, a broad spectrum. So the answer is yes, we do want them, but we want a broad swath of people so that we will have enough information to be able to give reasonable guidance to the general public. And the general public includes people just like the one that are characterized by the questioner.
Okay, thank you so much. We have another question coming up, and I want to make sure that that we get that asked. Okay, more education. This is from Dr. Lisa Fitzpatrick. More education, for example, vaccine additives. Let's educate ourselves instead of relying on the grapevine. I think a comment from that Reverend Curry, and I think that has to do with myth and misinformation, disinformation, rumor, and the like.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is critical that we get the credible information. The credible information comes from experts like the doctors on this line. They come from the Reed Tuxtons and the Montgomery Rices and certainly Dr. Clark. And we have to have you all share the information in the context of community. You are trusted figures. We see you, we understand, and we know you. And That will help us when we start to deal with all of the additives, like the question with regard to the mercury, like all of the other things. You can help us debunk those myths and talk about how they're myths, and talk about the seriousness of the things we need to hear, so that when we move forward, we will be able to have the credible information presented. This is really about honesty, honesty, honesty. And we know you care. So your ability to share and to be honest and to help us understand this is vital to our community, not just going on the grapevine.
Harold, in this
taking
regard,
everything
we had a
that they
question
say.
earlier in the chat line that I've been waiting to pose to the panel, and that is, someone wants to know, where can we go, to Reverend Curry's point, for more information? What are the trusted sources of information that we can refer people to? I'd be curious what the panel thinks about that.
Yeah, I want to ask Dr. Clark about that, because I think the reality is, and we've heard, as we've seen the growth in the anti-vaxxers movement, that there are just some people that are entrenched in their beliefs and will not listen to facts.
Yes. So I think it's important to know, just as Reverend Curry said, your doctor is a great source for trusted health information. I think all the organizations represented on this panel, the 4 HBCUs, the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, the BCAC is closely working with Howard University and by extension the other HBCUs to make sure that we are getting trusted information out into the community. So checking on the websites of academic medical centers, the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, for example, would be wonderful places to go to. There's also one point that I wanted to make that I'm not sure really emerged from this, and that's the watershed that the Tuskegee syphilis trial was. It was a wake-up call. Once that revelation came out of the atrocities that were committed, it was a wake-up call to the scientific community. And as such, a lot of the safeguards that you heard were put into place, like informed consent that Mr. Montgomery spoke about. The fact that community representation is on the review boards that approve whether trials go forward. All those ethical safeguards came about as a result of the Tuskegee syphilis trial. Those African-American men who suffered and died under that, and therefore I see, it was a horrendous thing, but they at least didn't die in vain, because it has reformed our whole system of doing clinical trials. And so those are some of the things that we, as the quote unquote experts, will be looking at to ensure that when we make a recommendation about whether the vaccine is safe and efficacious, and as you talk to your personal doctor about it, they'll be looking at the data from this trial to help try to give you a roadmap and ask those questions that Dr. Carlisle mentioned that everyone should ask their doctors.
I think there's one thing here, Harold, that I think is particularly important, and I think that Dr. Montgomery Rice can speak to this. I am aware, Dr. Montgomery Rice, that the 4 Black medical schools have put together a set of principles about that. Can you just share? I think this is the exact moment to try to understand that.
It bears repeating, Dr. Montgomery Rice, as it relates to those principles that you had discussed earlier, because they were really, they were very, very specific.
Yeah.
And I think for those people who did not hear you the first time, it does indeed bear repeating.
So the reason we felt that we really needed to do this was because we wanted the community to know that we see them and that we've been listening. And so it talks about respect for persons, demands that our communities enter into research voluntarily with adequate information, and that it ensures that our community will recognize the benefits and risks that may result from the improvement of knowledge through their participation in research. Now, what does that mean? That means that all communities ought to have the promise that science provides, right? The promise that discovery provides. And finally, justice will be achieved by ensuring that no person is denied participation in research without good reason, nor will anyone be unduly burdened by their participation. Now, what do we mean by that? We've been talking to these pharma companies and saying, look, if you want people to participate in these trials, tell us why you need to have 8 visits. You don't really need to have 8 visits. If you need 8, then let's have 4 of them be telehealth. And they're going to be 4 telehealth, then give them the device such that they can communicate. So all of those, we don't want people to be unduly burdened. And then we talked about specifically what we are going to make sure is that it is informed by rigorous science, carried out under the international rules governing safe and ethical conduct of research. We also have in here, you all, that we will be unbiased nor influenced by financial or non-financial conflicts. What does that mean? We all sign conflict of interest forms at Morehouse School of Medicine, at Meharry Medical College, at Charles Drew, at Howard University, because we are not going to have conflicts. We're going to only rely on peer-reviewed, transparent science to protect those who volunteer. It's about protection. It's about listening. It's about addressing people's concern. And at the end of the day, we're going to make sure that anybody that participates knows what their participation meant to the success of identifying an effective trial. So that means that we're going to communicate the results back to them, because that matters also.
I wanted to follow up with something that Dr. Clark was talking about. Of course, we mentioned, Tuskegee. And yesterday there were concerns about, Henrietta Lacks, for example. But when you're talking about the steep climb, there are the reports that are in the papers this week about ICE and undocumented immigrants coming to this country, and allegations of hysterectomies. When you have that kind of horrific news coming out, this does not help the kind of information that we are trying to give to people right now.
One of the great things that has happened with technology is that you can make things plain, can't you?
Yeah.
You can show things that would have never been shown, and people have ways of getting information out. And so we have to always remember that one of our first primary goals and responsibilities is to ensure that people are seen and heard, and we got to listen, and we have to be their advocates. And so I've recently read about what is happening in that situation, and we are trying to get more information, because one of the places that I think is here in Georgia. Okay, and we are trying to get more information about how this is happening. And when you take your eye off the ball, nefarious things happen. And what we can't do is take our eye off the ball. And that's why all of us are going to be looking closely to what's happening with this vaccine trial. We're not going to take our eye off the ball.
And I think, Harold, one of the things that came up yesterday in the conversation, which was also reflected in a lot of the chat, was that I think a lot of our listeners were surprised at the degree to which African-American physicians and scientists are in positions of influence and who are able to keep their eye on the ball. In this case with ICE, this is a situation where those people have no advocates inside. They don't have people who are representing them. But here yesterday, we had Gary Gibbons, the head of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, who was there. We had yesterday Dr. Frida Lewis Hall, who was the chief medical officer for the Pfizer Corporation. And all across the board, Dr. Hildreth, who is in a position where he is able to monitor as part of the team of people looking at this, at the research for the FDA, people like him looking at the research from outside, so that before the decision is made by the FDA, there will be outside eyeballs, and there will be physicians of color who will be part of those eyeballs. So the point being that I think that we are in a new day where we are inside now and not outside. And we have the ability to not only speak truth to power, but now we are increasingly power.
Mm-hmm. And I'd also like to add that the whistleblower for that very situation was an African-American nurse. And I salute her because she had the courage to come forward and say something. I think there's something to observe about that. And that's that, you know, we as the African-American community, one of the things that we suffered in the 20s, 30s, and 40s were forced sterilization of our women who went into hospitals to give birth and were specifically sterilized after that process was over. And so we have an empathy, we have a respect, I think, as African-American healthcare providers that is the same thing that informed the courage that nurse had in being a whistleblower. And I think we bring that same level of empathy and respect and advocacy to this situation as well.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word. We're going to say goodnight for this evening, but I want to remind you that this 2-night special will be rebroadcast on our sister station on WHUT-TV. Make sure you check your local listing for dates. And I certainly want to thank Dr. Valerie Montgomery Rice, president of the Morehouse School of Medicine, the Black Coalition Against COVID-19, Howard University, the Morehouse School of Medicine, Meharry Medical College, Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, the National Medical Association, the Cobb Institute, blackdoctor.org, and the National Urban League. And make sure to learn more about clinical trials and the vaccine process. Go to blackcoalitionagainstcovid.org. I'm Harold Fisher, and thank you so much for watching. Good night.